بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, it will be useful to do this explainer video about two-state solution, and you'll understand why. There's been quite a lot of talk about it in the last week, and I thought it would be quite useful to unpack some of what politicians have been saying recently. So I have a little presentation that I've prepared. Two-state solution, the promise of a Palestinian state, the lie of a two-state solution is what I've titled this video, and you'll understand why. So over the last few months with the war on Gaza, we've seen a lot of people talking about what happens after the war. What will the political settlement be like? Will the Zionist occupying force directly want to occupy Gaza? Will there be some kind of Palestinian authority in there allowing the people to come back and live? Is there a two-state solution possible? And various headlines like that. Actually, more recently, just in the last week, we've seen about a week ago, UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron saying the UK is considering recognizing a Palestinian state. We'll come back to some more of David Cameron's detail later. And secondly, reports from the United States, Biden says that a two-state solution is still possible after a call with Bibi Netanyahu. So this is the kind of headline we've seen in the last week. And actually the response from some people, some pro-Palestine activists have been, about time that Britain is doing justice to the Palestinians by thinking about recognizing a Palestinian state. Well, I would say it's very hard to trust a government that sells bombs to the Israeli occupying force one week and then pretends to be an honest broker the next. It's very hard to trust any government that has backed the occupation for over 75 years and then pretends to be an honest broker now. And I think when we break this down, you'll understand why I say that. And then on the other hand, you've got headlines like this in the last week. So on the bottom right-hand corner, an article in-depth article from Foreign Policy, the website, Middle East Paradox, it says, the Palestine-Israeli conflict has never been more dire, nor more ripe for resolution. So this is what I call like the prospect of what I call a dirty peace after a dirty war, that you've seen over successive conflicts, that the people who want to undermine the good future for the Palestinians, who want to secure the Zionist occupation of Palestine, often push for peace resolutions which undermine the interests of the Palestinian people and their claim over the land. At the same time that you hear this rhetoric about favorable prospects for a Palestinian state, you have the House of Representatives in America passing a bill banning the entry of PLO organizations into the US. Bizarre thing. That's just that one headline I saw this week. And also, you have Netanyahu rejecting the idea of a Palestinian state. So how do you reconcile all these things? Well, look at what David Cameron, first of all, is offering with Britain's 5-point plan for Palestine. So a push for a new international support package for Gaza. All rhetoric. There's nothing there. It's like a promise of some support for Gaza. I mean, you're talking about an ongoing slaughter, ongoing decimation and flattening and leveling of the entire Gaza Strip. And they're talking about some possible push for some international support package. Meaningless. Formation of a new Palestinian government for West Bank and Gaza. Again, rhetoric without any substance about who actually is going to form that government, really. And then the same old kind of things that the occupying force talk about: removal of Hamas's ability to attack Israel, releasing Israeli hostages held by Hamas, and the removal of key Hamas leaders from Gaza. So the usual kind of rhetoric, which is all kind of ongoing at the moment. That's not anything kind of like in the future. So what you see is here a little bit of rhetoric and no substance. The two-state solution, I say, is a lie because it's unworkable, and we'll see why. And as I say, I've mentioned this stuff before. It is unjust, and you will see why. And it is un-Islamic fundamentally, and we'll see why. Let's go back into history. Prior to World War I, what is today called Palestine, occupied Palestine, was part of the Uthmani Khilafah, the Ottoman Caliphate, and as such, it was governed as such. There were no borders between it and the surrounding areas of Bilad al-Sham, of what is today known as Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and Egypt. They were contiguous areas within the time of the Uthmani Khilafah. And actually, we had Muslims, Jews, Christians all living there side by side. These were Jewish citizens of the Ottoman Caliphate. You have a Yemeni Jewish man there, and you have Jewish ladies worshipping at the Burak Wall in the days of the Ottoman Khilafah. So the myth that people could not live in this land side by side is blown when you look at the history of the Ottoman Caliphate. And before that, actually, the only track record of people living peacefully in this land side by side with security and harmony was under Islamic civilization. During World War I, the European powers, Britain and France, secretly allied in 1916 to carve up the Middle East between them, drawing a line famously from the A of Acre to the L of Mosul, and a straight line north of that line was dominantly going to be for France, and south of that line was predominantly going to be for Britain. And the original idea was that Palestine itself would be under joint international control. It was not going to be, but the British wanted Palestine after World War I, and they very much got it under a League of Nations mandate. So the British had Palestine, the whole of Palestine, and they had their own proxy rulers in what was then called Transjordan. The British actually did install a proxy ruler into Syria. And that then became a French, if you like, colony after that for a while. The British held that mandate until 1948, and in the conflict during the time that the British occupied Palestine was such that tensions arose between the huge numbers of European migrants who were being shipped over into Palestine to occupy the land, and the resident Palestinians, and even in fact some of the Jewish people who were resident there for many years as well. The tensions became increased over that time, and what we saw was the British, when they saw their mandate period coming to an end, deciding that they were going to hand the issue over to the newly formed United Nations, newly formed after World War II. So the United Nations came up with this partition plan in 1947. And as I've said before, this is a nonsensical partition of any land. First of all, it is fundamentally unjust. You're effectively giving 50-50 of this land, which was almost all at one stage held by the Palestinian people. Their land, their farms, their homes, their orchards, their plantations were all going to be divided up. Secondly, the sort of orangish, sort of beige areas which were going to be the Palestinian areas, are absolutely not contiguous. They are divided up from each other, and the green areas, which were given to the newly migrated Jewish colonizers, were actually all contiguous. But they had organized politically and militarily, and they knew that these bottlenecks here in the north and in the west were going to make their new state very vulnerable. So they acted preemptively and decided to make war very soon after the British mandate ended, and destroying villages, taking over villages, driving people out, what we know as a Nakba. And what we have seen over successive decades is the land which was once a Palestinian area. Excuse me, my phone is buzzing, so I'm just going to... The land which was once the whole Palestinian area in yellow has gradually over the decades, right, shifted so that the Palestinian people, if they weren't driven out of Palestine altogether into surrounding countries, or if they weren't killed as well, where huge numbers were, then they were in two areas, which were the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. I've put this slide on the end as well, because this is actually the vision that the Zionists had for what they called Eretz Yisrael, where they don't just believe that the Zionist land should be what is today occupied Palestine. They believe it should be a section of Sinai and some of what is today in Jordan and some of what is today in Lebanon. They don't even call this the West Bank, they call it Judea and Samaria. And actually, when just before this latest conflict broke out in 2023, Netanyahu, speaking to the UN, held up a map where effectively there is no Palestine on his new Middle East. And this is a mainstream opinion amongst the politicians in the Zionist occupation. So this lady, the Israeli ambassador to the UK, Zippy Hotevli, she used to be a minister, Likud minister in their regime some years ago. She talks about what Likud believes in, which is that from the river Jordan, to the sea would be the entire Zionist state, so one state. Her dream is to see the Israeli flag fly over the Temple Mount, which means Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. So there's no hiding that from their perspective. So that is the Zionist vision, what Netanyahu and mainstream politicians there, I would say 90% of the political class really believe this, even so-called moderates in the region believe this. The US vision, the British vision, has been somewhat different. They believe that this place is their colony, and they always wanted a colony. Alexander Haig, former Secretary of State of the United States, he says it's the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk. And doesn't even carry one American soldier, and is located in a critical region for American national security. That was repeated by a presidential candidate, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., where he again described it as like having an aircraft carrier in the Middle East. If Israel disappeared, he said, Russia, China, and the BRICS countries would control 90% of the oil in the world. That would be cataclysmic for the US. And British used to say something like this as well. Ronald Storrs, former British governor of Jerusalem, once described it as a little loyal Jewish Ulster. So a colony like Northern Ireland was a colony. So the British, the Americans after the British, wanted a colony within the Middle East to secure their own interests. So the reason this is important is you will now understand some of the tension between what the Zionists want and what the dominant power in the world wants. And whilst the interests overlap largely, they don't overlap completely. So in the same week that Joe Biden can say, we can foresee a Palestinian state, meaning a two-state solution, so our colony will be there, but we'll do lip service to justice to the Palestinians. Same week he can say that, Netanyahu, representing the Zionist interests, will say, no, we don't want a Palestinian state. We want the whole lot ourselves. And you see that tension going on between them. You actually, this is a statement from Biden before he was president, if there were not an Israel, we'd have to invent one. This is a statement from, this is a video which you can find online of former US President Harry Truman talking about America's colonial agenda in Palestine, saying we had to do it in small doses. You can't move 5 or 6 million people out of a country and fill it up with 5 or 6 million people and expects both sets of them to be pleased. Eventually, we'll have them all satisfied. How he dreamed of that, I don't know. But effectively, the agenda is there. You're going to move out the entire Palestinian population and move in somebody else. And, you know, this is a mapping exercise that Ralph Peters, a former senior military officer in the United States, did, where he divided up the Middle East into kind of like, into even more small colonies and weaker divide and rule strategy in the Middle East. And you can see this idea of having even a small Palestinian state would fit into that very well. It would still mean that the Zionist occupation, which has external aid financially, militarily, politically, would be the strongest power in the region, would dominate in so many ways, even though it's very small in terms of size and population. So I said it's unjust and unworkable. Well, part of the unjust is the fact that what would be a future Palestinian state that Cameron, Britain, Biden, United States, and the international community would accept would be approximately 15% of historic Palestine. So if you would be surrendering 85%. I said it's unworkable. Why? Because if you look at the two aspects, one is I mean, this map is prior to October 2023. What is now Gaza, the Gaza Strip, is decimated. It's unworkable. I mean, it's like it's destroyed. And what is the West Bank is like the Balkans. It's like divided islands. The green areas are the areas under the Palestinian Authority, which effectively has the same authority as like a local town council would in a country like Britain. Clean the streets, empty the bins, a little bit of policing in the dark green areas. In the light green areas and the pink areas, even the policing is done by the Zionist occupying force. So this is utterly unworkable and unjust in terms of any kind of state. And it's in those pink areas that you have what is commonly known as the illegal settlers. And those settlers have grown over the decades. And this is a map giving some idea of where all the settlements are. And in the last 3 to 4 months, the settlers have become more bold, more aggressive. They've been armed by the Zionist occupying politicians. So it comes back to the UK and the US statements. Why do they make these statements? Well, these statements are aimed at two things. First, it is to slightly pacify international opinion on the ground, which is outraged at the fact that these states in the West are effectively backing a genocide. So by mentioning that they want some kind of Palestinian state, it kind of gives people hope. And sadly, you do see that. You see respected commentators saying, oh, finally, Britain's foreign secretary is talking about the Palestinian rights. Well, what they're talking about is that, and that is not anybody's rights. That is going to have no military, no defense. It's going to be at the mercy of the occupiers, even if they were given statehood. And the other thing you see is this language about recognizing a Palestinian state. It is sometimes used as a tool in the tension between the Zionist politicians like Netanyahu and the colonial power, the United States. So you see this, on the one day, Biden will say something, and on the next day, Netanyahu will say something. I said it's un-Islamic, and the answer to this comes from really one of our last great leaders in the Muslim world, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, last great Khalifa, you can say, not the last Khalifa, but the last Khalifa with any significant power, who was once offered to sell the land of Palestine when a time when the Ottoman Khilafah was in great debt, and he said he won't sell a single inch. It isn't his to sell. So it is Islamic land. It isn't his to sell. So he recognized that. And if you want to even look at it in personal terms, those people who've been driven out since 1948, whose homes, whose farms, whose plantations, whose orchard, all of those things that have been stolen and taken, tell me, who is it that has the right to just say and sign it away and say, yeah, okay, somebody else can now have that permanently? Who can do that except the legitimate owners of the land from an Islamic perspective? They can't. You cannot just surrender somebody else's land and give it up, really. That the right of return, the right to have what was usurped from them has to be a right, as well as the general fact that this whole region was Islamic land. And actually, the myth and the lies that are peddled out there is that Islam cannot have a workable solution because people see it through the lens of their own nationalistic agenda, which they have around the world. But actually, in history, when Islamic civilization ruled this region, you had people of different faiths, Jews, Muslims, Christians, living side by side. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he talked about Islam spreading to other lands, and he said, this is a hadith, a translation of a hadith mentioned in Sahih Muslim, invite the people to migrate to the land of the Muhajirun. And if they do, if you become contiguous with the Islamic land, then inform them that actually you'll have all the privileges and obligations, all the rights and responsibilities, if you like, of the people of that land. So you become effectively like equal subjects, equal citizens, if you like, in that way. So these are some arguments that explain why the two-state solution is a lie, why it's unjust, why it's unworkable, why it's un-Islamic, and why you see this conflicting rhetoric coming out all the time. I hope that was helpful. say it's a bit of a repetition of stuff I've said before, but it's useful, I think, in the context of what we've heard this week. And inshallah, see you again soon. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.